All right. Good morning. This is Chapter 22, Lecture B. A couple, a couple reminders here. If you have not got all your Chapter 21 or before stuff, I'm giving you until Friday to get caught up. Most of you are getting caught up, but please be due diligent. I've got all the tests that have graded. I'm still missing one that's from here. Hopefully that will be finished today. But all other schools, everything has been graded, and I'll get those back to the other schools here before too long. Okay, yesterday we in the class talking about getting into the start of World War II. So if you back up just a little bit to yesterday, the United States by the late 30s started taking actions against Nazi Germany and eventually Japan in 1940-41. Biggest thing that the Americans are going to do against the Japanese, we're going to freeze their assets, meaning all their money in the States, and then oil and rubber supplies that we're going to cut off. Strategic materials, it's often called. And the Japanese were very upset by this. Fast forward to by the end of November 41, we knew that the Japanese were going to assault some base in the Pacific. It was imminent. We just didn't know exactly where. If we knew that much, which that is a given history now, why was it Pearl Harbor on higher alert? I'm not going to get into the debate about that. But the Japanese ultimately picked Pearl Harbor as their attack. The attack was orchestrated by a guy named Admiral Yamamoto, who was American, trained as far as education, went to university in the United States, actually respecting the United States. So December 7th, the attack went underway. It was complete surprise and devastation to U.S. forces there in the Pacific. Early warning signs were missed. There was at least 3 signs that Pearl Harbor was going to be hit that were missed. One, the morning of December 7th, a radar station was actually operating on Hawaii, a gift from the British, but it picked up the whole armada of planes. But it was written off as a flight of B-17 bombers coming in from California. So that early, and plus we didn't understand radar fully, but they were picked up about 45 minutes before the attack began. Second, about the same time that the radar picked up aircraft, a destroyer was on patrol around the Pearl Harbor. Saw a Japanese submarine surface, and it sunk it within minutes of seeing it. But it was written off that he was a young commander, maybe got a little skittish, dropping depth charges just for fun. And so that clearly showed that the Japanese were initiating some type of attack or were doing something that morning. Out of all this, so Pearl Harbor is attacked. The primary objective for the Japanese was the aircraft carriers. The battleships, yes, were nice to be destroyed, but the real target that the Japanese wanted was the aircraft carriers because they saw them as the greatest threat. The evening of December 6th, the aircraft carriers left Pearl Harbor. We do know for a fact the Japanese had spies in Pearl Harbor, though there's no spies during World War II of Japanese and America being convicted or anything. We do know they had spies because they even accounted from their own testimony that their intelligence said that the aircraft carriers were there the day of December 6th. And so the carriers mysteriously disappeared. Yeah, I mean, I don't need to go into a lot of detail about Pearl Harbor. We'll go into a little bit more of the strategy here in a second. That's a picture of Battleship Row on fire. Congress voted the next day 477 to 1 to go to war with Japan. The only person to vote against war was Janet Rankin of Montana. She voted against it. Interesting fact, she was one of the only few to vote against World War I. She's also the first female representative ever in the House of Representatives. She was elected right at the onset of World War I, and then she left office for several years and came back, and then she is the only person to vote against war in World War II.
Do they know why the aircraft carriers left the night before?
Well, let's look at the map here. So if you're on your fighting your slides, we'll go to the map now. This is where I'm actually pretty in-depth knowledge of Pearl Harbor. When I was a kid, this was like my favorite thing to study, and I did a lot of research and presentation on it. Essentially, the aircraft carriers got orders to leave, from what I gather, the evening of December 6th, to go out and engage in sea operations. Now, Is it coincidence? Did the government know? I'm not going to hear the debate. I do know I had a great uncle, and I grew up in a period when there was a lot of World War II vets, and I thought it was universal that World War II vets loved President Roosevelt, FDR. I brought up FDR's name, and I thought he was going to kill me. He was convinced that, and he was in the Navy, he was convinced that Roosevelt knew about Pearl Harbor. So that was something that I'm not saying he was right, but it was something I never really grasped until I got older. There's evidence that the U.S. may have knew the target more in depth than we let on. That being said, do I think we led the slaughter of thousands of Americans? I don't necessarily go to that degree. But at the end of the day, let's think about it. Was FDR going to get the United States in war with Germany and Japan? No. The only way we could go to war was what?
If they attacked us.
If they attacked us. So do we position ourselves to be attacked? I would say we did.
Yeah.
We enticed them, right? Now, after Pearl Harbor, Americans' call for war is pretty big, right? Revenge Pearl Harbor. Now, if you look at it, all these ships here in Pearl Harbor, they're old ships. The other thing that we don't realize about Pearl Harbor is most of the battleships and everything, they were outdated. Doesn't mean they weren't important, but they weren't the cream of the crops. Most of these ships would not have seen a lot of service in World War II. They were old. They were derelict.
So
Now, going back to the late 30s, and this is where Roosevelt kind of foresaw the future a little bit, and going back to his World War I days, we started building a Navy in the late 30s. We went on a massive peacetime buildup of the Navy. So all these ships here, they're on their way out. So is their loss really that significant to the U.S. forces? It is in the short term. Obviously, we didn't want to lose them, but long term, these ships are not going. Because if you look at the Arizona, here, we'll take a second because this is actually interesting, and you can Google it on your own if you don't. I want to show you perspective. The most famous battleship of Pearl Harbor was what? USS Arizona, right? If you actually look at the Arizona, right before the onset of the war, that's an old battleship. Still got a gun, but you can see it's an older design, almost World War I design, right? Now let's fast forward and look at the new battleships that were laid in the late 30s, early 40s. And not just because we're proud Missourians, but the Missouri. By the way, if you didn't know, the U.S. Missouri is considered the greatest battleship ever constructed. Look at the design difference. What do you notice right off the bat about the Missouri versus the Arizona?
They're more flat.
It's a lot more
compact down in.
Yeah, and you want to see something that kind of summarizes it up a little bit too. It doesn't have like 4 or 5 guns. It has 3 massive guns, a lot of anti-aircraft guns, and it has a helipad. I mean, it's designed for well, this wasn't a helipad originally. They had planes that they could, like water planes they could shoot off. Massive, right? Modern technology, a lot lower profile, but bigger, right? State of the art.
How big is it? Like, how long?
I don't remember the length of it without looking up the dimensions. But you can see this looks modern. Even today's world, this looks like it could go out and be active, right?
Yeah.
There was 4 or 5 of these. They were called the Iowa class carriers in Missouri, Wisconsin, Iowa, New Jersey, I think. Maybe the Wisconsin. Did I say Wisconsin? There was about 4 or 5 of these battleships ever built. And the greatest of them was the Missouri. Or I should say the most famous, and the last to be retired from service. And I think they even designed it. I don't think they ever put it on there, but I think they had the idea that they could potentially launch from the guns nuclear weapons. Yeah, if you want to talk about a crazy thing, we haven't got to the end of the war yet. The Army had an artillery round that you could put into an artillery, basically a shell, and then shoot it from a launcher. The only problem was they had problems shooting far enough to stay out of the radiation when you shot it. Anyway, the point of this is the old washed up, it's like the back lot of the used car dealership, right? You want to sell those cars, but if they get hail damage or totaled, are you going to be mad? No. We'll use them, but we're going to move on.
What does Pearl Harbor look like now, after?
I mean, the harbor's still the same, but now it's not. It's a lot more regulated. If you look at the island itself, I know you guys probably can't see me when I'm looking up here at the board, but if you look at the map of Pearl Harbor, the middle, which is Ford Island or Naval Air Station, the Missouri is about where the California is or the Neosho was, right behind the Arizona. So the Arizona is still there, the memorial. So these two are not active ports for the Navy. And the way they did it is it symbolizes the Arizona is the start of World War II, the Missouri is the end of World War II. And there's another vessel that's still in Pearl Harbor, the Utah, right up here. The Utah is a memorial still in Pearl Harbor. So fighting the war, World War II, fighting World War II 5. The war in the Pacific, the Japanese took much of the Pacific right after this endeavor. And it's very fast, bold. So the Japanese strike as fast as they could. They will actually take parts of Alaska. And I'm not talking about Alaska proper. I'm talking about the little tail that everyone always forgets about Alaska, right? They're going to take a lot of, they're going to take the Philippines. They're going to take a lot of French or former French land. They're going to get French Indochina because the Germans took over France. They'll take Dutch East Indies, Burma, Guam, New Guinea, Guadalcanal, islands that the British had occupied. When the Philippines fall, Americans are going to pull out the most famous general there, which is General MacArthur. Several thousand U.S. soldiers will be trapped there on the Bataan Peninsula. They'll be forced to walk several, 50 to 100 miles to a camp where many of them will die. It's called the Bataan Death March. Shortly thereafter, so the Japanese have expanded. They're going through the Pacific. They're making their march. One thing the Americans had going for them, we broke the Japanese code. We knew what they were doing. We knew all their messages, and they didn't know this. We found out at the last moment that they were planning to attack Australia, specifically Coral Sea. So if you look on a map, and I have a map here in my room, but if you look at Australia, just directly north right here is Coral Sea. It's a big sea. I mean, it's part of the Pacific Ocean, but it's just the specifically named sea. We rushed forces there, and we stopped the Japanese advancement. Now, it's technically a draw in battle, but who really benefits from this draw? The Japanese or the Americans? Americans, right? We protect Australia. It's preserved for the moment. We don't repulse the Japanese completely. The Japanese are not sent packing. We stunt them, and it's kind of like we pull back our forces a little bit. But the Japanese pull back to regroup. We pull back to regroup. The other thing, before the Battle of Coral Sea, the Japanese Navy had been split into two forces. One to go to Coral Sea. The other was Midway. We knew about a Midway actually pretty far in advance. I want to say a week in advance. So we mobilized all the forces we could, including those that had been badly damaged at Coral Sea, and rushed into Midway. We laid a trap for the Japanese, and we actually inflicted heavy casualties on the Japanese at Pearl Harbor, or Midway. I'm going to bring up my actual, and you guys have probably seen this before. This is another PowerPoint. You may not, if you probably can't see this on the lecture, but up on the board, this is the Battle of Midway. We sunk 4 of the aircraft carriers. And by the way, all 4 of these were involved in the Pearl Harbor raid. So we put a lot of revenge on Pearl Harbor. Midway is a very small island. It's part of the Hawaiian Islands, technically, just a little bit further north, about 50 miles. So this was a strategic air base that the Japanese could attack Hawaii and then eventually the coast. But when we sink these 4 carriers, they sink one of ours, the Yorktown, which survived the Battle of Coral Sea. So we lost 2 carriers between Coral Sea and Midway, the Yorktown and the Lexington. We could replace them. We already had new ships coming off the line, right? When we sink the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, they can't replace them. Nope. And so this is a huge, huge blow to the Japanese. And the way it worked was, imagine you're a pilot flying. So at Midway, we don't have modern radar. The Americans send out squadrons, right? One squadron gets completely almost annihilated. Japanese find and destroy it. But but then another squadron is literally lost in the clouds. So imagine and then usually cruise 2 to 3 depending on the fighter you were in, like a Dauntless or other fighter aircraft. I think the Dauntless was the primary one. Or you might be in an F4 or Wildcat. The Hellcat was the later version that was much better. But a Dauntless cruise, you have a gunner and a pilot, right? And you have one bomb underneath your bottom of your plane. Imagine you and your buddy like Brock Dalton, you're flying. Zach's the wingman. Man, I can't see anything. You're flying. All three of you flown, right? You remember when you go up and down air, like through the clouds, you see nothing, right? And then all of a sudden, hey, there's everything. They're flying through the clouds, and all of a sudden, the squadron of Dauntlesses, dive bombers, and they like beep, holy beep. There's the whole beeping Navy. Imagine this not on fire. They see the whole Japanese Navy before them. Oh, by the way, the Japanese didn't have any air cover at that moment. Why? They were refueling all their planes. If you know anything about aircraft carriers, what is the strongest part of the aircraft carrier? On top or underneath? Right, the deck, right? So you have armor to protect from bombs coming through, right? Well, the Japanese have good armor. The problem is to speed up their rearmoring. Where are all the planes at? Are they below deck or on top?
On top.
Normally they're on below. That's the normal procedure, but to speed it up, they did it on top. So you drop a bomb on a 30, 40 aircraft, all refueling, and they have bombs on themselves. It's like dominoes, checkmate. Boom. Boom, 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 boom. Yeah, pretty devastating. Doesn't take very many planes to hit direct strikes on the flight deck to invoke heavy damage on these carriers. We hit the jackpot, and the Japanese can never recover from this. I mean, it was, in terms of loss, this would be like, if you could watch football with the Chiefs, it'd be like the Chiefs losing Patrick Mahomes, Sammy Watkins, Tyreek Hill, and Travis Kelce all in one play. That's pretty devastating, right? If you watch the Chiefs. Or even if you look at the Warriors in the NBA losing Kevin Durant, Steph Curry, and Thompson, right? Or is it? Yeah, it's Thompson, right? You lose all three of those guys, that decimates they're still deep, but you get the picture. Now, at the conclusion of Midway, or right up to Midway, the Japanese controlled a large part of Russia, China, all of French Indochina, the old French colonies, all basically Malaysia, the East Indies, what they call them, New Guinea, lots of random little islands throughout the Pacific, the Philippines. It's a huge empire.
Was Russia attacking them at this time as well?
Okay, so at this point, USSR is more occupied with the Germans. Because if you look at the map, Manchuria, which fluctuates between Russia and China,
Right.
that's not a huge populated area at this point by the Russians, or the Soviets, I should say. At this point in 42, the Germans have made it hugely, almost all of Europe, Russia, or the Soviet Union is occupied by Germans. So the Germans are going to, they'll be worried about Japan, but they're going to focus more on, they're not at war with Japan at this point, I don't believe. And this is where the borders kind of gets murky still. The point of this is the Soviets weren't concerned about Japan. They were concerned about Hitler.
What about China?
Well, China had been at war since 1931. 1931, this is when the Chinese or Japanese came in. So the Japanese and the Chinese had been at war for a while.
The Chinese have like tons of people.
At this point, they're not very effective.
They're training.
Japan's a modern military empire. Japan is a backwater or China is a third world country. Technically, China is still rated as a third world country. They just don't have the resources to fight. I mean, they have resources, but they're not mobilized. They're not modernized. They're not unified. There has been a civil war going on in China at this point between the nationalists and the communists.
Yeah, the dictator dude.
Yeah, Mao. And so the Japanese take advantage of this. They have a huge area. So, fighting World War II, the sixth slide of this part. We're going to have what's called the Grand Alliance, United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, or often we will call the Allies of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Britain and the United States makes sense. Roosevelt and Churchill had already been working together closely. But after Hitler invaded in 1942, or was it 41? No, it's 42. After he invades the Soviet Union, the USSR will then join the United States and Great Britain. But until Hitler invades the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union is not part of that alliance. Stalin, after Hitler invades, wanted to extend enough control over Eastern Europe not to be invaded again. So once Stalin stops Hitler's advance in the Soviet Union and basically pushes them back, he wanted to take as much of Eastern Europe as he could as a buffer. And you guys already, with me, have went through the Cold War and all the control of the like Poland, East Germany, all this, right? Romania. He wanted to basically build a wall of countries, so if the Germans or any other country kind of got crazy again, they'd invade that instead. That being said, Churchill, his big goal, preserve the British Empire. They wanted to keep as much colonies. The reality after this is what breaks the British finally. The British have been the most powerful country up to World War II. After this is where the United States will supplant the British as the most powerful country in the world. At this point, this is survival for the British, and they want to retain as many of their territories as they can. Stalin also wanted them to attack as soon as possible France, as early as 42, 43, but we weren't ready yet. The reality of this was we took Churchill's advice, and instead of invading France in 1943, we go and attack through Africa, trying to do what they call the soft underbelly, go up through Italy. The other reality was we realized Stalin was a pretty bad person. So if many Soviets die or Stalin's inflicted a heavy damage, are we going to lose sleep over it? No. And Stalin knew that too. He knew that we were letting them take their lick. In 1943, Allies gained the upper hand. The British and American destroyers and planes devastated the German submarine fleet. So by 43, the American combined effort with the British is going to take a heavy toll on the German submarine fleet. It'll be greatly reduced. The Germans have no surface fleet really to speak of. The only major battleship they built that we know of is the Bismarck, and then the British will hunt it down and destroy it early in the war. Popular uprising in 43 led to the overthrow of the Mussolini government. So in 43, Mussolini will be actually overthrown in Rome. Problem is, German troops will come in to kind of reinforce Mussolini, though Mussolini will be removed. Italy will basically split. There'll be a great line in Italy where they can't move north. They try to move north a couple times, but it's super, super bloody. Stalingrad in 1942 to 43, it's estimated that 13.6 million Germans died during the war. 10 million came from it on the Russian front. So meaning the Americans and the British only inflicted 3 million casualties. Put in perspective, a whole army, so we're talking hundreds of thousands of troops, a whole army is destroyed in the fight for Stalingrad. 90,000 prisoners of war are taken at Stalingrad. 5,000 make it back to Germany. 90,000 POWs. 5,000 only make it back, give or take. Yeah, that's pretty devastating. D-Day will finally be planned for 44, the invasion of the Normandy coast, after much delay. You guys have studied this in great depth. General Patton, who had been part of the Underbelly campaign, will be relieved of command for slapping a soldier. He literally tells the soldier to snap out of it, slaps him, and is removed from command. But he'll be sent home for a while, but he's the perfect diversion. Hitler was afraid, the Germans were afraid of Patton. They will literally send Patton to a point in England that's the closest between France and England. They're going to set up a fake army. They hire Hollywood balloon people. They create a whole fake army with nobody there but Patton. And the Germans buy it as a diversion. and then over 200,000 Allied troops airborne and land, invade, and take the Normandy coast. Which I don't need to explain that to you guys. You guys have played it in video games, unless you played Battlefield 5, which apparently you're never the Americans. And then, but there's been a lot of video games, Band of Brothers, Saving Private Ryan, etc. The other thing that happens during this that we find out about is the Holocaust, the mass extermination of undesirables across Europe, which I think they've estimated 6 million Jews and another 4 or 5 million gays, homosexuals, blacks, gypsies were killed as well. Primarily the focus was Jews, but there's also several other million people that are killed. D-Day invasion. There were several beaches heads. The Canadians actually have a beach of their own, along with the British, because they're part of the British Empire. There's Sword, Juneau, Gold, and then Omaha and Utah Beach. The primary American beaches was Omaha and Utah. The most bloody beach of them all is Omaha. That's where the massive fortification you've seen, like Saving Private Ryan, occur. So if you look at this graphic, it shows you the full effect of D-Day. And I could spend days talking about D-Day. What was crazy was the morning of D-Day, December 6th. That morning, that night into that morning, the Navy started a round-the-clock bombardment for hours. They shelled the coast. By the way, one of the cruisers or destroyers, I think it was the cruiser, maybe it was a battleship. I think it was in Nevada actually. Had been in Pearl Harbor, been refitted, sent to Normandy, fired the first shot, or was part of the barrage that hit the coast, which is a pretty cool fact. After the naval bombardment stopped, actually, I can't remember if it was the airborne or the naval. I think actually, take that back. The airborne went in first. The 101, the 82nd Airborne, paratrooped behind enemy lines, all across here, trying to take out artillery defense zones that could hit the beach. As they landed and they were all off, the artillery came overhead, hitting the beach. So American troops are behind enemy lines, inserted, trying to distract the Germans, and then the beaches hit. So it's a 3-4 phase operation here. Initially, they didn't know if it was going to be a success, but it ends up being a resounding success. We capture the beaches in relatively good fashion. And then here's photos from D-Day. Obviously, the very famous hitting the beaches. The tide was low, actually helped American troops. Eisenhower was in charge of it, and then the paratroopers in. Okay, we'll talk about the home front tomorrow. We're going to do a lot of stuff tomorrow, but today we're going to wrap up. Have a good day.